I'm sure you've read an article or maybe seen a newscast, maybe a podcast that says the economy has grown at 2, 3, maybe 4%. But what exactly does that mean? What are they actually referencing? Well, that is a reference to gross domestic product, GDP. This is a calculation that is performed to judge the size of an economy of a country. And in this video, we're going to go through what GDP exactly is and try to make some sense of what gross domestic product represents. Stay to the end of the video because I'm going to go through the 10 largest countries in the world based upon GDP. All right, let's dive into gross domestic product. Let's go. The first question we need to answer is, what exactly is GDP? GDP is the measure of a country's macroeconomy. This is the market value of a country's economy, which is the sum total of its final goods and services produced within the country in a given time period. It is one of the primary indicators used to gauge the size of an economy. This can be applied to any individual country. The United States absolutely makes this calculation, but other countries do as well. Why even make this calculation? What is it even used for? Well, policymakers, economists, investors, business owners will use this metric to judge the growth and health of an economy. The White House and Congress can use this to justify spending and tax policy. The Federal Reserve uses GDP to help set monetary policy. State and local governments rely on GDP too to set local policies. Businesses use these stats to help make decisions about jobs and future investments. What GDP can do is give you a sense of the health of a country's economy. Is the country expanding or contracting? Rising GDP typically indicates economic growth and a healthier economy. Falling GDP may suggest economic troubles, or maybe you're heading into a recession. One version of the definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP. A 10% decrease in GDP could signal a depression. So this is a statistic that is taken very seriously. If you've gotten any value out of this video so far, please smash that like button and consider subscribing. So how do you calculate GDP? There are 3 primary ways to calculate GDP. If you've taken a high school economics or college economics course, you're going to be familiar with the formula C plus I plus G plus M minus X. This is the expenditure method. The expenditure method adds up all the spending on final goods and services, which is the formula we just went over, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Let's break down the individual pieces of the expenditure method. C, consumption. This is the sum of all private consumer spending within a country's economy, including durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. This number grows as more is consumed and is normally the largest part of GDP. Like inflation, a slow and steady rise in this figure demonstrates consumer confidence in the spending compared to a declining figure where the uncertainty of the future is causing consumers to hold back on spending. I do have another video that I'll link in the description that goes over inflation and the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. Check that out after this video. I, investment, this is the sum of a country's investment on capital equipment and inventories. This is going to be any type of capital asset. Increases in investment can indicate increases in productivity, along with positive signs for employment rates. Decreases in investments can signal the opposite. This does not include investments such as stocks and bonds. Think businesses buying business assets, equipment, factories, technology, and inventory. The G of the equation, government spending. This is the total government expenditures, including salaries of government employees, roads, constructions, repair, public schools, military, etc. All the things the government spends tax dollars on. And to reference the category, this category in particular is funded by taxpayers. It is collected by governments. And also, if they borrow funds, this is another way that the government spending can increase. So taxes contribute to this along with government borrowed funds. Then we got the X and M. This part of the equation is going to represent net imports or net exports. Exports are goods and services that companies in the country produce and sell to other countries. Imports are goods and services bought by private consumers, businesses, and governments from other countries. For example, if a company outsources production to another country, that production is counted in that country's GDP, not the country that did the outsourcing. Our second way to calculate GDP is the income method. which equals all incomes earned by individuals and businesses in the country, including wages, profits, rents, and taxes, less any government subsidies. This calculation should look very similar to the expenditure method, and the Federal Reserve will do both of these calculations to make sure they are in line, to make sure they're providing accurate GDP data. Now, the income method, this is where they're gathering statistical information primarily from the IRS, but there's some other government sources that are going to be providing data so they can do this calculation. Now, let's just break down the pieces real quick. Compensation of employees, this is wages and salary. This will be any sort of fringe benefits, healthcare, rent. This is going to be rental income, anyone that's renting real estate. Interest, this is going to be interest that is being lent to other parties that is earned by individuals and business. Proprietary income is going to be your self-employed individuals. Corporate profits, these are businesses that are generating goods and services. Indirect taxes, less government subsidies. These are going to be taxes like sales tax, excise tax. And the last piece, to gross this all up, you're going to add back any depreciation into your calculation. You're going to add that back to the calculation to get a full capital asset picture within the income method. The third way to calculate GDP is the production method. This adds up all the value of the goods and services produced in an economy, and then it subtracts the value of the inputs used in the production. That is another way to calculate GDP. So who actually does the calculation? We just went over how to do the calculation, some of the sources of where that calculation comes from, but who actually does that calculation? Well, in the United States, this is going to be the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA. This is going to be part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they're using data, as we kind of discussed, from the Census Bureau, Internal Revenue Service, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve. They also put out surveys to individuals and businesses to gather additional data. The BEA primarily uses the expenditure method to track GDP, but uses other methods to validate accuracy, like the income method. The BEA calculates quarterly and annual GDP figures for the United States. They release 3 versions of each quarterly GDP report. They have an advanced estimate, which is about 1 month after the quarter ends. They revise that estimate with a second estimate once they've gathered more data. And then finally, they have a third estimate that has a more complete version for that quarter. Let's talk about real GDP versus nominal GDP. Which is better? What is a better indicator, and what's the difference? Nominal GDP is the calculation at face value, which has inflation baked into it. Real GDP takes the inflation out of the equation, so you have apples to apples comparison to what the calculation actually is. This is a better indicator to carve out inflation to get a better idea of how well the economy is working. In other words, real GDP measures the value of goods and services using constant prices from a base year, which removes, as we discussed, the factors of inflation. All right, let's talk per capita GDP. We're going to take the gross number of the GDP calculation and divide it by the population. GDP per capita measures a country's macroeconomy relative to its population size. It is calculated by dividing the country's GDP by its population, as we discussed. This metric helps comparability among countries who have larger economies and populations. For example, a country might have a large economy and a large population, but the per capita GDP might be low when compared to a smaller country. You take the gross GDP divided by the population, you get a static number. This helps comparing living standards and economic progress when you're looking at countries with lower populations. And you'll see that the last slide I have on here, you're going to see how per capita GDP, the countries that are listed there, the highest ones, are not always the same one with the largest economies. What are the limitations of GDP? Well, first, it doesn't measure non-market activities. So volunteer work, unpaid work isn't factored into the economy. So that's a missing part of the calculation. It doesn't measure income inequality within a country. There could be very, very poor and very, very rich. And that overall calculation doesn't factor in the standard of living. You just have this large number. Even the per capita doesn't give it a sense of how well the entire population is living or what the standard of living looks like. The quality of life considerations like happiness or environmental health. A country can have a high GDP and still have poor life satisfaction. 4, it counts bad spending as positive. If the government spends a ton of money, it's going to ramp up GDP. If they borrow a bunch of money and spend it, it's going to make GDP go higher. all financial transactions are counted as economic activity, even if they don't improve the productivity or well-being of the economy. And another one is excludes environmental costs. You can do a ton of growth. You can invest in a ton of things. Could be destroying your country because the pollution is so terrible from this economic growth. Economic activity might be positive, but industrial waste and pollution are making the standard of living worse. Those are just a couple examples of how there are limitations within this GDP metric. Now let's talk about who has the highest GDP. We're going to look at it from a gross GDP perspective and a per capita, and you'll see some of the same countries on the list for both, but you'll see there are differences. Who has the highest GDP? And I'm grabbing two statistics here from two different sources. So GDP, you have the United States at about 29 trillion. You have China at 18.5 trillion. Germany at almost 5 trillion. Japan, 4 trillion. India, 4 trillion. United Kingdom, 3.6, etc. So you could get a sense of how large some of these economies are in the world when you're calculating GDP. Now let's flip over to per capita, and you'll see some different countries. This is taking the gross GDP divided by the population, a better idea of what the living standard, or at least from a GDP per capita, some of these countries look like Luxembourg, $140,000 per person. Ireland, $108,000. Switzerland, $105,000. Singapore, $93,000. Iceland, $90,000. None of those were on the largest GDPs from the prior data. This is showing that these countries the populations are smaller, but the per capita GDP is much higher. That gives you a better sense of what the standard of living is in certain countries versus other. You might have a huge economy, but you have a large population, and your per capita GDP isn't as comparable to some of these smaller countries that have actually a stronger GDP per capita, and that might translate into a higher standard of living. That's GDP at a fairly high level, gross domestic product. So the next time you hear that in the news, you'll have a better idea of what that actually means. I hope you learned something from this video. Have a good rest of the day. Take care, and goodbye.